He came home without warning, expecting smiles, laughter, and a warm embrace. Instead, he opened the door to a silent house, a shattered picture frame on the floor, and his cousin's face marked by something far darker than time apart. What he was about to uncover would change both of their lives forever, and it all began on that quiet street in Harbor's Edge. If you are new to the channel, then please subscribe to the channel and like the video, and tell us where you are watching from. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let us know what you think. Now, let's jump into the story. The coastal town of Harbor's Edge was the kind of place where the sea air carried the smell of salt and old stories. Fishing boats rocked in the harbor, their paint peeling from years in the sun, and gulls cried overhead like watchful sentries. Jonah Mercer had grown up here, knowing every bend in the winding streets and every face in the corner cafe. Yet today, as he stepped off the bus with a worn duffel over his shoulder, the town felt strangely different. Jonah's return was not planned in the usual way. There were no phone calls ahead, no hints to friends or family. After a year of serving as a medic overseas, his journey had ended earlier than expected due to an injury. It wasn't severe enough to keep him from walking, but it was enough to bring him home months before anyone thought they would see him. He had decided to keep it a secret, picturing the surprise on his younger cousin Emily's face, imagining his grandmother's delighted laugh. As he walked through the streets toward their house, the familiar sights gave him a small comfort. The old bakery still had the same faded sign. The lighthouse still stood tall against the wind, its white paint bright against the blue sky. He could almost taste his grandmother's fresh bread and hear Emily's quick footsteps as she raced to greet him. When Jonah turned onto the narrow lane where their house sat, he noticed the garden first. Weeds had claimed the flower beds, creeping up the path to the porch. The roses his grandmother once tended so carefully hung limp, their petals scattered on the ground. He slowed his pace, his boots crunching over loose gravel. The front door was closed, but as he climbed the steps, a hollow sound echoed beneath his feet. He reached for the handle and paused. It was unlocked. That was unusual. His grandmother had always been careful, checking the locks twice before bed. He stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking softly under his weight. The air was still, and a faint scent of dust hung in the rooms. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting pale lines across the furniture. Jonah's eyes swept the space, taking in the coffee cup on the kitchen table, still half full, and the coat draped carelessly over the back of a chair. It was too quiet. The house had always been filled with sound. Pots clattering in the kitchen, Emily's laughter drifting down the hallway, his grandmother humming as she worked. Now it was only the sound of his own breath. He called out, "Emily?" His voice seemed to vanish into the stillness. No answer. He tried again, louder this time. "Emily, it's Jonah." Still nothing. He moved toward the staircase, each step measured and slow. The air seemed heavier upstairs, as if it was holding something he couldn't yet see. He passed the hallway mirror, catching a glimpse of his own reflection. Tired eyes, a face roughened by sun and travel. At the end of the hall, Emily's door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open gently. The room was dim, the curtains drawn. In the corner he saw her, curled up on her bed, with her back to the door. For a moment, he simply stood there, unsure if he should speak. She hadn't heard him come in. He took a small step forward and said softly, "Emily." She turned quickly, startled, and her eyes widened as she recognized him. There was a flicker of shock, Then something else. Something that made his heart sink. Jonah had imagined this moment countless times. He thought she would run to him, maybe laugh and cry at the same time. Instead, her expression held no joy. Her eyes were rimmed red, and a shadow of something unspoken lingered there. He dropped his duffel to the floor and crossed the room in 2 strides. "Hey, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice low and careful. Emily tried to smile, but it faltered almost immediately. She shook her head, looking down. Jonah noticed the faint mark along her jaw, a discoloration that wasn't the result of an accidental bump. His chest tightened. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Instead, she pulled her knees closer to her chest, as though she wanted to disappear into the blanket wrapped around her. Jonah knelt beside the bed, his mind racing. Something had happened here while he was away. Something serious. Outside, the sound of distant waves rolled in from the shore, steady and relentless. Inside, Jonah knew one thing for certain. His homecoming would not be the joyful reunion he had imagined. Something had changed in Harbor's Edge, and he was determined to find out what it was. Jonah stayed kneeling beside Emily's bed, waiting for her to speak, but the silence stretched like a heavy curtain between them. He noticed her hands trembling slightly, her gaze fixed on the blanket instead of his face. His mind turned over possibilities, but each one felt worse than the last. He took a slow breath. "Emily, I'm here now. Whatever it is, you can tell me." Her lips parted, but no words came. She glanced toward the door as if afraid someone might be listening. Jonah followed her eyes, sensing the weight of her fear. He leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Is someone hurting you?" A small tear slid down her cheek. She didn't answer directly, but the way her shoulders shook told him enough. He wanted to press for details, but he knew pushing too hard might cause her to shut down completely. Instead, he sat beside her and stayed quiet until the trembling eased. As the evening light faded, they moved to the kitchen. Jonah made tea the same way their grandmother used to, strong and slightly sweet. They sat at the worn table, steam rising between them. The warm, familiar scent seemed to loosen something in Emily. After a long pause, she began to speak, her voice soft and uneven. "Grandma's gone," she said. Jonah felt the words like a sudden drop in his chest. "Gone? What do you mean?" "She passed away," Emily continued, 3 months ago. Pneumonia. It happened so fast." She swallowed hard. "They said they tried to reach you, but—" Jonah's hands tightened around the mug. He thought of the chaotic months overseas, the missed messages, the moments when communication lines had gone silent. Somewhere in that storm, the news of his grandmother's passing had been lost. Emily went on, her tone growing more fragile. "After the funeral, I didn't know what to do. I didn't have anyone close. Then Bradley showed up. He used to know Grandma from years back. He said he didn't want me to be alone." Jonah listened, every muscle in his body tense. "At first, he helped with things," she said. "Groceries, bills, fixing stuff around the house. But then, he started making rules. Told me what I could talk to, when I could go out, what I could wear. If I didn't do things his way, he got angry." Her voice wavered. "It started with shouting. Then it wasn't just shouting anymore." Jonah felt his pulse quicken. "The mark on your face," he said quietly. She looked away, nodding slightly. He took a steadying breath, forcing his voice to remain calm. "How long has this been going on?" "Since about a month after he moved in," she whispered. "I tried to leave once, but he said no one would believe me. He said he'd make sure I regretted it." The words sank into Jonah like cold water. He had seen many things in his time as a medic, but the idea of his cousin, just 17, living in fear inside her own home, filled him with a sharp, protective anger. He leaned forward. "Emily, Listen to me. This isn't your fault, and you're not alone anymore. I'm going to make sure you're safe. I promise." She studied his face, searching for any sign of doubt. Finding none, she gave a small nod. Jonah knew promises weren't enough. Action was what mattered. He began to think like he had in the field, methodically, strategically. Rushing in without a plan would only risk making things worse. He needed information. He needed help from people he trusted. After Emily went to bed that night, Jonah stayed at the kitchen table, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the room. He reached for his phone and sent a message to an old friend, Liam, who now worked in local law enforcement. He contacted a volunteer from a youth protection group he had met during a community outreach project. Lastly, he left a voicemail for a social worker who specialized in helping young people in unsafe homes. He didn't share every detail yet, just enough to alert them that something urgent was happening and that he would call again soon with more. Jonah closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the distant sound of waves hitting the shore. He thought of his grandmother's voice, telling him to look out for family, to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. The next step would be difficult. Bradley would have to be confronted, but it couldn't be rushed. Every move had to be careful, every piece of evidence ready. Jonah looked down the hallway toward Emily's room. He could hear the faint sound of her moving under the blankets, restless in her sleep. He knew that the fear she carried wouldn't fade overnight, but he also knew that fear had met its match. In that moment, Jonah made a silent vow. Whatever it took, however long it took, he would protect her and end the shadow that had settled over their home. The tide in Harbor's Edge was about to turn, and it would not turn back. The morning light in Harbor's Edge was pale and cool, slipping through the curtains in quiet stripes. Jonah woke early, his mind already racing. The conversation with Emily from the night before replayed in his head. Every word, every pause, every flicker of fear in her eyes had settled deep in his chest. He knew today could be the day that everything began to change. He moved through the kitchen in near silence, making coffee and checking his phone. 3 messages had come in overnight. One from Liam, confirming he could stop by later. Another from the youth protection volunteer, offering resources. And the last from the social worker, ready to meet whenever needed. Jonah's years in the service had taught him that timing and preparation were everything. He sat down at the table with a notebook and began to plan. He listed the steps he needed to take, gather solid evidence, ensure Emily's safety, and coordinate with the right people so there would be no gaps in their case. He started by asking Emily, gently, if she was ready to share more details. She hesitated at first, her hands fidgeting in her lap. But Jonah's calm presence encouraged her to speak. She told him about the insults, the time she had been stopped from leaving the house, the threats Bradley made when he felt she wasn't following his rules. She also mentioned a small notebook she had kept hidden under a loose floorboard in her room, where she wrote down dates and what happened each time. That notebook became their first piece of evidence. Jonah photographed each page carefully, making sure the writing was clear. He also took discreet pictures of the fading bruise along her jawline, saving them in a secure folder. He knew they needed more, but this was a strong start. By midday, Liam arrived in plain clothes to avoid drawing attention. They spoke quietly in the living room, going over what Jonah had gathered so far. Liam advised that they document everything and, if possible, record an interaction where Bradley displayed controlling or aggressive behavior. It was risky, but Jonah understood the importance. The opportunity came sooner than expected. That afternoon, Jonah told Emily he would be stepping out to the store. It was part of the plan, to make Bradley believe the house was unguarded. Jonah set up a small audio recorder in the kitchen and positioned his phone to capture the room. Then he left, parking his truck just around the corner where he could return quickly. Less than an hour later, Bradley walked through the door. The sound of keys hitting the counter echoed sharply. His voice carried down the hall, sharp and cold. "Emily, why isn't the living room clean?" Emily's reply was quiet, but clear enough for the recorder. "I was just about to finish it." Bradley's tone hardened. "You think that's good enough? I told you what happens when you don't listen." The scrape of a chair sounded, followed by heavy footsteps. That was the moment Jonah stepped in. He moved quickly and silently, appearing in the kitchen doorway. His voice was steady, calm, but edged with steel. "That's enough." Bradley turned, startled. "Who the—" "I'm her cousin," Jonah interrupted, stepping closer. "And you just crossed the line for the last time." Bradley tried to recover his composure. "This is none of your business." "It is now," Jonah replied, his eyes locked on him. "The police are already on their way. You're done here." Bradley's face shifted from anger to uncertainty. The distant sound of sirens began to swell. Jonah had timed it perfectly. Liam had arranged for officers to arrive within minutes of his call. When the police entered, Jonah handed them the notebook, the photos, and the audio recording. Emily stayed behind him, safe from the confrontation. Bradley was read his rights and escorted out of the house, his protests growing weaker as the officers led him away. Once the door closed, the silence felt different, not heavy or fearful, but lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. Emily leaned against the wall, her shoulders dropping with relief. Jonah put a reassuring hand on her arm. "You're safe now. We'll make sure it stays that way." Outside, the sirens faded into the distance. Inside, Jonah knew this was only the first step in rebuilding the life that had been taken from Emily. There would be challenges ahead: court dates, emotional recovery, and the slow process of trust returning. But this was the turning point. For the first time in months, Emily could breathe without fear. And Jonah, standing in the quiet kitchen of their grandmother's home, felt certain that they had just taken back something far more valuable than a house. They had taken back freedom. The days after Bradley's arrest passed in a quiet rhythm that felt almost strange at first. The house in Harbor's Edge, once filled with tension, now breathed again. Sunlight fell warmly through the windows, carrying the scent of the sea. The air seemed lighter, the rooms no longer holding shadows that clung to the corners. Jonah moved quickly to make the home feel safe for Emily. The first step was legal. He filed the paperwork to become her official guardian. The process took time, but with the help of the social worker and Liam's support, it went smoothly. Knowing she would not be left alone again gave Emily a visible sense of relief. Once the legal matters were in motion, Jonah turned to the physical space. He painted the walls in soft, calming colors, repaired the old bookshelf in the living room, and fixed the front porch steps that had been creaking for years. He even replanted the garden, replacing weeds with bright flowers that their grandmother had once loved. Emily often joined him, her hands in the soil, the act of planting something new, giving her a sense of quiet hope. Slowly, the routines of normal life returned. Emily went back to school, where her teachers welcomed her with kindness and patience. A retired neighbor, Mrs. Carter, who had once taught music, stopped by one afternoon with an old guitar she no longer used. "I remember you talking about learning to play," she told Emily. "Thought you might like to start again." Emily smiled, one of her first genuine smiles in months, and took the guitar with gratitude. Jonah encouraged her to reconnect with friends, though he never pushed. He drove her to therapy sessions twice a week, waiting outside until she was ready to come home. Some nights were harder than others. The memories would come back, and the fear would flicker in her eyes. On those nights, Jonah sat with her in the living room, a quiet presence until she felt safe enough to sleep. The community began to notice the change. Neighbors who had kept their distance before now reached out. The owner of the small seaside cafe offered Emily a weekend job, saying she could use the extra help during tourist season. A retired math teacher volunteered to help her prepare for college entrance exams. These gestures, big and small, wove together into a net of support that strengthened each day. As the months passed, Emily's confidence grew. She began to talk more about her plans for the future: college, studying environmental science, and maybe even working to protect the coastline she had grown up beside. Jonah listened with quiet pride, knowing how far she had come. 1 year after that turning point, the town held its annual Harbor's Edge Summer Festival. It was a tradition filled with music, food, and speeches from community members. This year, Emily had been asked to speak. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she was ready to stand in front of so many people. But with gentle encouragement from Jonah and her friends, she agreed. The evening of the festival, the main street was strung with lights, and the scent of grilled food drifted through the air. When it was her turn, Emily stepped onto the small stage. She looked out at the faces, friends, neighbors, and strangers alike, and took a steady breath. Her voice was clear. "There was a time when I thought my life would always be small and filled with fear. But I learned something important. We are stronger than we think, especially when we have people who believe in us. Sometimes the right person shows up at exactly the right time, and they remind us that we are worth protecting. They help us remember that even in the hardest moments, the future can still be bright." The crowd listened in silence, the words settling like gentle waves against the shore. When she finished, applause filled the air. Jonah stood near the front, his hands in his pockets, a quiet smile on his face. He wasn't one for big displays, but the pride in his eyes spoke louder than words. Later that night, back at the house, they sat together on the porch. The garden was alive with color, the sound of the ocean steady in the background. Jonah handed Emily a cup of tea, and for a while, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. The peace they shared was enough. In Harbor's Edge, life had not returned to what it was before. It had grown into something new. The pain had not been forgotten, but it had been met with courage, kindness, and the steady choice to move forward. And in that home, on that quiet street, they both knew the truth. Healing is not about erasing the past, but about building something stronger in its place.